Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Um, we're just waiting for more people to enter, and then we'll start in a couple of minutes. Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Yasmin Shazli, Deputy Director for Research and Programs at the American Research Center in Egypt, and it is a real pleasure to open this evening's book discussion. Tonight's book is Ancient Egyptian Animal Fables, Tree Climbing Hippos and Ennobled Mice by Dr. Jennifer Babcock. It takes up one of the most curious bodies of imagery to come out of the New Kingdom Thebes, drawings on ostraca and papyri of animals acting like people. Hippos climbing trees, cats waiting on mice, donkeys cast as officials. Dr. Babcock argues these are not simply visual jokes. They illustrate animal fables drawn from a larger mythological narrative and were part of the religious life of New Kingdom Thebes. The book situates this material within wider storytelling and artistic traditions across cultures and periods, and it is the first thorough art historical treatment of these ostraca and papyri, taking their iconography and aesthetic choices seriously on their own terms. A few words about our author. Dr. Babcock holds her degree from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University and teaches art history at Pratt Institute and the Fashion Institute of Technology, SUNY, while also advising graduate students in NYU's Visual Arts Administration program. She has previously held research and curatorial positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. Beyond tonight's book, she recently co-edited Rethinking Ancient Egypt, Studies in Honor of Anne Macy Roth. Her scholarship focuses on ancient Egyptian animal imagery, the role of animals in Egyptian religion, and the modern reception of ancient Egyptian culture. We are delighted to have her with us tonight. To walk us, well, I will walk you through very quickly. Dr. Babcock will be giving a 20-minute presentation, and this will be followed by Q&A from our audience. And I'll now give the floor to India, who will tell you how the discussion will proceed.
Hello, everyone. So your questions should be directed to the Q&A box. I also put a note in the chat. And at the end of it, all the questions that are in the Q&A box will be answered by Ms. Babcock and I believe Yasmin as well. Okay, enjoy the lecture.
And I would like to add, if you want to make a comment or discuss something, you can put it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, now we give the floor to Dr. Babcock.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be invited to talk about my book here for ARCE's Library Book Club. So I'm going to be talking about Ancient Egyptian Animal Fables, which was published in 2022 with Brill. This is based on the dissertation that I wrote at the Institute of Fine Arts. So I'm going to provide a casual overview of the book, introducing the corpus of material in some detail, as well as providing an overview of the main arguments that I make in the book. And then I'll also, of course, provide time for discussion and also questions. So this is the material that my book talks about, and I'm going to be talking about today. As you can see, it's images of anthropomorphized animals or animals who are behaving like humans, drawn on papyri as well as ostraca, which are limestone flakes. But before I go into detail about these images, I also want to talk about the structure of the book for a second. This is my table of contents in my book. The crux of my argument really rests on chapters 5 and 6, but of course, the previous chapters help build the foundation getting up to that point. Specifically, chapter 2 contextualizes the material that I introduce in chapter 1. And this chapter talks about the site of Deir Modina, which is where we believe the craftsmen and the laborers who worked on the royal tombs lived, and where we believe these images might be from. So I talk a little bit more about the town and the people who live in the town. Chapter 3, of course, is about ancient Egyptian aesthetic value, but trying to understand it not through money and so like material value, which is often how Egyptian art is discussed, but thinking about some of the more conceptual ways that we can reconstruct value. So like what is an image's cultural value or its religious significance? The reason why I do this is because in order to understand the value that the ostraca had, we have to imagine, go beyond its materiality, which because ostraca have no real inherent worth, as it's been described, being throwaway material. And the papyri are also not terribly expensive, which is something that most people don't realize, but this was something that was argued by Jan Jasmin, whose work I looked at quite a bit when trying to understand the economy of New Kingdom Thebes. So here I try to, again, get a better understanding of what are some other ways that we can understand value. Chapter 4, I connect the ostraca and papyri imagery to visual narratives. I talk about visual narrative imagery in ancient Egypt in general, but I then focus on the ostraca and papyri to present the possibility that they represent animal fables or oral folklore that has been lost. A lot of what I wrote in chapter 4 is also based on earlier scholarship done by Diana Flores and notably Emma Brunner Trout, who also were the people who connected the imagery to animal fables. But it's really in the last two chapters, 5 and 6, where I push this interpretation further. And I not only recognize these images as being representative of animal fables, but I try to imagine the context in which these animal fables would have been important. So connecting the imagery to a larger religious and cultural landscape. So like I said, we believe that the imagery come from Deir Medina. So just to situate ourselves, that's in Upper Egypt and in Western Thebes. The people who lived in Deir Medina, again, are the ones who worked on the royal tombs during this time. So in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. So the town itself is very conveniently located and is adjacent to these sites. It's also very close to a number of mortuary temples. And most of the inhabitants living in Deir Medina are coming from the 18th to the 20th dynasties. This is just a photograph of Deir Medina from above. So you can see that it is indeed in this valley with limestone everywhere, limestone cliffs. So this is how one of the reasons why we believe the ostraca come from here. And then here is also a map that shows us The other things that are around the village, which you can see is a walled, densely packed village, but there's cemeteries and notably a number of tombs and cemeteries and temples, some of them dedicated to gods, but also some of them are mortuary temples dedicated to a number of kings. And then, of course, we have the Great Pit over here, which is where we found a lot of material that helped us understand the day-to-day lives of the people living in this village. Um, so as I said, there's a general assumption that this material, the images that depict anthropomorphized animals, come from Deir el-Medina. And there's a number of reasons for that. So we actually don't know in many cases where these are from, but they were purchased, many of them in Luxor on the art market, and then they eventually made their way to museum collections, some of them in Egypt, but many of them ended up in Europe and, of course, the United States. So the fact that they were purchased in Luxor sort of hints to an origin in Deir el-Medina. There's also the fact that, we have lots of limestone, right? Of course, limestone isn't unique to Deir el-Medina necessarily, but also the quality of the illustrations, which are often quite high and is what you would expect from a community of artists. Now, in my book, I also talk about how there's much more variety in the imagery in terms of skill than maybe many people presume, right? So in my art historical treatment, I noted that there is quite a diverse level of skill ranges. The images I'm showing here are examples of some of the more highly skilled drawings. Another reason why we assume that they might be from Deir el-Medina is because of the content of the imagery. For a lot of them, we see this is maybe the most famous type of image we find from, or motif we find from this corpus of illustrations where we have an elite mouse being served by a cat. So there's a role reversal here, which might reflect some social hierarchy and class tensions, basically. And we know that such things existed in Thebes in the New Kingdom because we have the Turin Papyrus, which is the first recorded labor strike in our human history. And so we know that the workers at one point stopped getting paid, and then they decided to stop working. So people have made the argument that these types of images, these topsy-turvy images, are maybe a reflection of this tension. Maybe it's like a byproduct of, these strikes, for instance. However, I make the argument in my book that while this might be true, there's other things that we need to consider. So one, not every image that are part of the anthropomorphized animal corpus show this clear role reversal. And that this type of image that we're looking at here is only one of many categories of images and motifs that we find. In my book, I identify 9 different categories, which I'm going to very quickly go through with you all now. So the first one is the boy, cat, and the mouse. And so there's actually only 3 images that belong to this category, but it's an important category because this is a collection that really shows that there is narrative potential here, where we have a stock cast of characters and there seems to be a narrative sequence. So if you look at the images, there's an indication that they were likely done by different artists. That's one thing that we can talk about later. But we see, on the one hand, we have the boy being beaten by the cat, and then we have the boy being beaten by both the cat and the mouse. And then we have another image where the boy is beating the cat, and then the mouse is overlooking everything. So again, some sort of narrative sequence is happening. It seems to be telling us a story. The second category are these elite animals. This is the one, maybe the most well-known type, right? Where you have the elite mouse being waited on by the cats. They do compose of most of the corpus that we have, at least in the ostraca. So we have about 79 ostraca and maybe a little less than 30 of this type of image. We also have a category that I call the hippo and the crow. And So here are just a couple of examples. There's actually 3 in total. One is a vignette that's found in the Turin papyrus, but in the ostracon that's now in the Cairo Agricultural Museum, we have the hippo stuck in a tree with a crow trying to climb up a ladder to get to it. And then we have an ostracon where the tree isn't there, but we have a hippo sitting on or standing on a scale with a crow opposite it. It's not really clear what this means, but again, it doesn't really fit into the whole idea necessarily of a topsy-turvy world that shows social discontent. We have chariot riding scenes. This is also featured heavily in the Turin papyrus. And in the papyrus, it looks like we have mice that are riding chariots and they're at war. And the ostraca depictions, it's not really clear if they're at war, if they're hunting, if these are royal mouse or elite mice. But we do have a collection of them. And these are some examples. We also have images depicting religious processions or religious activities. In this example on the right, which is from the IFAO, we have a jackal raising its hands up in adoration. And then on the left, we have an ostracon depicting jackals, presumably priestly jackals, holding up a palanquin with a deity on the top. Then we have ostraca and images related to agriculture, food production, and pastoral scenes. So we have some depictions of cats that are shepherding birds, and then sometimes we see animals that are making beer and bread, like what we see in the far right. Lots of images of animal musicians, so different animals playing musical instruments of different types. And then I have a category that I've just called miscellaneous or unclear because either the actions are ambiguous or the image is too damaged to really tell what is going on. And then we have this final category, which is maybe one of the most important categories because I think it helps explain why we have all of these images. So this is the distant goddess. Now, for this, I have to give a lot of credit to Emma Brunner-Traut. She was the first to look at the ostracon from the Egyptisches Museum in Berlin and make the argument that this is a representation of the distant goddess myth, which is not preserved in writing in the New Kingdom, but is preserved in a much later Demotic papyrus. I have made the addition of including the ostracon from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this collection. And I'm going to just go ahead and explain a little bit about the distant goddess myth and show you the different characters on this ostracon, or these ostraca, as a bit of a refresher. So Emma Brunner-Traut was making the argument that the feline that we see in the Berlin ostracon, and which I have also identified in the Met, is a representation of the goddess Tefnut. So according to the Demotic papyrus, Tefnut gets in some kind of argument with her father Re and transforms herself into a wildcat and goes to Nubia. Now, Tefnut is also the goddess of moisture, so when she leaves and goes to Nubia, she also takes the moisture of the land with her, which means she leaves Egypt in a bit of a disarray. People are suffering in her absence because there's droughts and famine and so on. So Ray knows that this is a problem, and according to the myth, he sends down the god Thoth, who we know is oftentimes associated with a baboon. In the papyrus, he's described as being a sort of dog baboon, so some sort of composite creature, but here in these ostraca, it's represented as a baboon. And because he's so eloquent and able to persuade, he is down to try to persuade Tefnut to come back to Egypt. And he does this by trying to placate her and playing her music, but also telling her stories. And according to Emma Brunner-Traut, the story that he is telling her is represented in the upper part of the Berlin ostracon. So part of this fable is preserved in the Demotic papyrus. It talks about a vulture and a cat who make an oath to each other not to harm each other's young. And unfortunately, that part of the papyrus is destroyed, so we don't quite know what happens, but we know that a betrayal happens. Now, very quickly, I want to acknowledge that this image does not occur in the Met Ostracon. Instead, we have this lower register that depicts some sort of youth. And it's unclear to me if this lower register is actually related to what we have in the upper register. But I also know that there are many ostraca that serve multiple purposes. So this is a little ambiguous, but nonetheless, I think what we're seeing here, at least with the Berlin ostracon, is this representation of this fable. And so in my book, I make the argument that perhaps all of these other ostraca that we are looking at that are part of this corpus are fragments of the different types of fables that maybe Thoth would have been telling Tefnut. I think one of the reasons why the image of the mouse being in power over the cats is so common is because I think that this was maybe one of the more popular stories to tell. It may have been one of the major fables in this mythological frame, because you can imagine Thoth is trying to appeal to Tefnut's pride and saying, hey, look at what's happening now that you've left Egypt. These cats are in charge, are no longer in charge. And of course, Tefnut is a cat when she is confronted by Tefnut. So he's showing her this sort of role reversal as a way to tell a moralistic lesson. And that is the purpose of animal fables many times. It's to bring forth these types of moralistic methods. They tell us what to do and what not to do. And these types of role reversals we also find in Egyptian literature, ancient Egyptian literature, and not only just ancient Egyptian literature, but propagandistic ancient Egyptian literature. So these are a couple of examples that talk about, oh, look at the land of Egypt where the poor are now rich and the rich are now poor. And when you read further along in the story, you realize that actually no one benefits from this situation. So the purpose of this literature is to ensure that people live by a certain status quo, where the pharaoh or the king is in charge, and that people have their place in this social economic hierarchy. So I think that's what's going on with these animal fables as well. Now, Emma Berner-Trout, in her book on animal fables, she actually cites this Coptic image as an image that illustrates this return to peace, this return to normalcy. So it dates much later. Again, it's Coptic, so from the Christian era. And in this image, we see a bunch of mice, rodents who are presenting gifts to a cat. And I actually found a contemporaneous image to the other ostraca and papyri from the Louvre, where we see two cats dressed as elites. One cat is seated on the throne and being served by another cat. There's this hieratic inscription that doesn't really give us too much more context, unfortunately, but it does seem to be maybe this return to order, which is supposed to happen if we are to follow the literature as a model. Now, I contextualize all of this within the New Year's festivals of Egypt, where we have a lot of drinking and merrymaking, dancing, also music playing, and storytelling. And I want to bring in this papyrus because I think this papyrus really tells us a lot of how the animal imagery works in the context of this annual festival. So this is the Turin papyrus. It's sometimes just called the erotic papyrus because people tend to focus on one side of the papyrus and not the other. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of people had trouble reconciling the fact that the erotic imagery seems to have nothing to do with the animal imagery. That is, until you place it in the context of this annual festival. So Anne Macy Roth presented at the ICE conference in Cairo a while back and noted that the men in this papyrus look like the Baldwins of Hathor. So these are priests who are working in the temples. And so what we're looking at here are maybe these bald ones of Hathor having sexual intercourse with, these priestesses of Hathor, or maybe Hathor herself. And so this is a way of celebrating Hathor, who is an aspect, of course, of Tefnut. And it's about regeneration and fertility to the land. And then the anthropomorphized animals are the fables that Tefnut is told that helps bring her back to Egypt, thereby bringing fertility to the land. Um, and we know that the anthropomorphized animal imagery is important to the religious life of the ancient Egyptians because we see them appear on temple walls much later in Egyptian history, so in the Ptolemaic period and also in the Third Intermediate period. So there, and also in these temples that are related to Hathor or aspects of Hathor. So that is essentially my argument here that I wanted to provide an overview for, and I will just end this here. And then we can leave some time for any questions or discussions. But thank you so much for being here and for listening.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I really want to congratulate you on this book because I feel it is what you did with the ostraca, given that there's no specific provenance. There's a
Mhm.
problem with the provenance. Most of them were purchased, and the fact that there are no inscriptions, there's no text, and you managed to come up with all these very convincing conclusions. I think that's amazing. I'll start off by asking one question. So, who do you think the audience was for the ostraca? And do you think there is a specific gender, given that what we know about the literacy of women in Dir Medina,
Mhm.
or was it something that was uh, like storytelling during the festival? How do you think this was done? Who were the audience? Who was the audience?
It's a great question, and I think that I don't think there's one single answer. I think that these materials, like many things from ancient Egypt, there's multiple purposes and audiences in mind here. Um, I think that I could see the ostraca as being part of the festivities, something that, while people are dancing, you would have like an area perhaps where people are retelling these stories. And I can imagine them using these ostraca and papyri as ways to help with the storytelling tradition. I also think that there's an aspect of it where they are intended for the goddess as well. And so you would maybe leave them, again, this is the problem with the lack of provenance, of course, that it would have been really great if we knew, hey, this one was hanging out in a chapel somewhere or a domestic shrine. But it seems like I would imagine that these could be things that are left somewhere as a gift. And we have lots of examples of votive ostraca from Deir Medina, of course. So I think that's within the realm of possibility, where the goddess herself, is receiving them. And then by giving this as a gift, you're sort of role playing in a way, like you're serving in this role of Thoth, like reminding her of these stories. Um, and then the fact that there is no text too, I think opens up the audience more. I do think it was meant for like everybody. I think this is an example of popular religion, and part of that is because of the fact that these are not just made by super talented artists either. Like if you look at in the image section of my book, there's the image of the Basil papyrus. Like it's not a very well drawn papyrus at all. It seems to be somebody who might be learning, they might be an apprentice, but somebody who's not quite as skilled.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But there were some with that were very were
Oh
drawn by
yeah,
very skilled artists. So you have,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
this variation.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we have two questions right now.
Okay. I'm trying to
Uh, yeah.
I'm trying to, oh, there it is. I couldn't open
Yeah, I
these
know it's tricky.
windows. Um, Edith, I see you have a question on how many of the ostraca fall into multiple categories. That's a great question. And I don't have it memorized, but some are, I'm going to open up my copy of my own book so I can look. But like the category I was only able to really categorize the ostraca specifically because the papyri makes it a little more complicated because you have multiple vignettes on one papyri. But of the ostraca, and there's 79 of those, um, you have, for instance, three of the cat, boy, and mouse. And I don't remember the exact number for the elite animals, but it's somewhere in the upper 20s. It does vary quite a bit. For the hippopotamus and the crow of the ostraca, we only have three or two examples, but across materials, we also, if we include that one vignette from the Turin papyrus, it would be three examples of that type. So there is a lot of variation as well. Um, I do have it sorted in the appendix of my book, so that is something that you could look into and try to. I should have made like a chart. Like there's certain things where when I go back and might see my book, I'm like, I wish I did that. But lesson learned, maybe for the future. Um, okay, and then I see, oh, how many fall into multiple categories? That's a good question too. So like the problem with, the categories that I created, it does help organize your thoughts a little bit, but it doesn't allow for you to think about some images maybe crossing over into others. So I had to sort of make decisions when I was putting this book together, where I make the decision, for instance, that um I don't know. I'm trying to think, like chariot riding, for instance, wouldn't necessarily be elite animals. So there is, you could make the argument that there's crossover here. I hope that helps answer that question a little bit better. And as for the papyri, that's I would say that the most of the papyri pretty much maintain, or at least the Cairo papyrus, it's like almost exclusively these elite animals. But when you look at the British Museum's papyrus, it's a mix where you have the elite imagery, but you also have some that are more miscellaneous. Like there's one where a lion and a gazelle are playing board games with each other. Um, I s- so hopefully that answered the question, but if you need a follow-up, I'm happy to answer that. I see this other question that says, could you explain more about the bald ones of Hathor? When is the annual festival and what's their role in the festival? Did you say the same festival traditions continue to the Ptolemaic times? Um, the bald ones of Hathor, I don't know if I can maybe find the source. It's definitely footnoted in my book. But somebody else wrote in a lot more detail about who they are and what their specific role may be. Um, I think you can find that in the fifth or sixth chapter. But they seem to have been priests that helped service the temple and were maybe subservient to any priestesses of Hathor. I'm not sure necessarily why they have their hair done in such a distinctive manner where they just shave the top of the head. That just seems to be that's just, how they chose to fashion themselves. The annual festival happens, approximately, when they are, I believe it would be like the fall, right? And so that would be over a period where they're harvesting essentially. And as for the bald ones of Hathor's role during this festival, that I'm not completely sure of, other than that there would be a lot of activity in these temples dedicated to Hathor, to Tefnut, to other aspects of Hathor as well. And so they would have been pretty important during this time. And it does seem the art historical and archaeological evidence seems to suggest that we have a lot of these same festival traditions that continue to the Ptolemaic period, at least, just because we have those images of animal musicians and elite animals depicted on the walls. So it seems, and then of course we have the Demotic Papyrus that talks about this whole distant goddess myth as well. So, which is related, of course, to these New Year's festivals. This is asking if I see any connections between the erotic scenes and Bacchanalia. That is a great question. I personally do. I mean, I'm not a classicist, but I do teach art history and I have to look at a lot of images from other cultures. And I think that there often is because we see first of all, there's a lot of drinking that is involved in this festival. The other thing that I've noticed as well is that if you look at the Turin Papyrus, for instance, the genitalia of the men are very exaggerated, very large. We don't typically see penises in Egyptian art anyway. And then when you look at the Greek material, you do see a lot of male nudity, but usually the penis is de-emphasized. It's not made to be, it's purposely made smaller, actually, until you get to the Bacchanalia scenes, in which case the genitalia is often also exaggerated as well. I'm not saying that the two, these I don't know if Egypt influenced, these festivals in Greece. I'm not arguing that. I think that, these things can independently happen as well, but it is sort of an interesting cultural parallel. Um, and then I have a question asking if it's possible to access a recording of this later and how, and I don't know the answer to that.
Will be up to you if you want it to be online, and we can discuss this later. But if it will be online, it will be under our resources section, I think. So
Yeah.
you will find it
I
on our website.
Yeah, I would have no problem sharing this recording. So I guess look out for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Um, what are the prospects of more examples being discovered in better condition and context?
That's a That's a good question. I mean, I don't, I guess it's always possible to find more. In fact, while I was researching, or developing my dissertation into a book, I learned about the Basel Papyrus, which for whatever reason, a lot of people had just sort of forgotten about, because it's not published in Diane Flores's study in her article about this material, and it wasn't discussed in Emma Bruna Trout's discussion of animal fables. And I forget how I came across, I found an article somewhere that talked about how this was a lost papyrus, and I looked at it and realized, oh, this belongs to this corpus. And this was pretty recent, within the last 20 years or so. So, I mean, I would imagine that if we find something, it's very likely that it's probably hidden in some museum collection somewhere. Because the other thing too is that with a lot of ostraca especially, they're kind of been treated for so long as things that you don't have to pay that much attention to because they look like messy drawings. Or even if they are nice, it's not like the very beautiful royal relief. And for a long time, this is what, museums valued and what we valued oftentimes working in museums, which is why it's really important to understand, by the way, the endemic ancient Egyptian understanding of value construction, because even if we didn't inherently see the value in these images, they were clearly very valuable to the ancient Egyptians. Um, would we be able to find them in better condition? I guess that depends on how they've been stored at these museums. And in terms of context, that's harder. I think, if these were mainly from Dara Medina, I guess there's always a chance that we could find more, but we'll have to see. And I do want to also stress that likely, I mean, I would imagine that there's no reason to think that this only happened in Dara Medina or even in Western Thebes. So I think, yeah, that it is always a possibility. And inshallah, we'll find something that helps us better understand the context of these images.
Yeah, you never know what you can discover in Egypt.
It's true.
Excavations there are many surprises that come through excavations, so you never know. But the image of the most famous image of the cat waiting on the elite mouse.
Hmm.
This appeared in the graffiti of the 2011 revolution in Egypt on and it was used, of course, as a satire. Uh,
Right.
do you think the ancient Egyptians would have had fun with this? Would they have seen it also as this reversal of roles as also a satire? Could it have served more than one, read in different ways, or not?
Yeah,
I know it's hard to know, but what do you
yeah.
think?
So I'm of many minds of this. I never like to close the door on interpretations unless you find something that just completely discredits, an argument or a way of thinking about something. And I'm not ready to close the door on this interpretation. I don't think it's the primary purpose for these images, like some people have argued. I think the primary purpose was religious. However, I also think that ancient Egyptians, especially living in Dera Medina and going through the strike, and if we assume that these were made around that time, um, that this would not have been lost on them, and
Yeah,
that they would have, made this connection, and there may have been, this acknowledgement of, how it could, be an image that actually works for the status quo, but there's maybe also, this other purpose. I mean, as we know, the ancient Egyptians too are often sort of grappling with often contradictory concepts. And
mm,
so I think that, it could be possible. I also, there's a part of me too that feels like, I don't know, there's like a part of me that also feels like they're more reluctant as a culture to necessarily, openly make this type of imagery, but it's also such an unusual thing to see the strike papyrus. I mean, I can't imagine that was maybe the first time something like that happened
yeah,
also. But yeah, I guess my final answer is that I think the primary purpose is, religious and,
yeah,
fulfilling this sort of mythical reenactment, but that there is also an acknowledgement that you could possibly see it as a satirical type of reading, but I think that would have been maybe like a secondary function
yeah.
for it.
Yeah, maybe like an internal joke while they were drawing them or
Yeah.
something. Like this is
Yeah.
sincere.
Yeah.
But what I find fascinating about figured ostraca, and I love them absolutely, and not just the anthropomorphic ones,
Hmm.
the anthropomorphized animal ones. One of my favorite pieces is the nude lute player.
Hmm.
Because and all the figured ostraca, they show you the capabilities of ancient Egyptian artists and that they could produce art that was not restricted by the rules of the rules of formal art.
Right.
And that's what I find fascinating. And I always like to show people the that ostracon of the nude lute player to show that, they could draw in different ways. They didn't
Yeah,
draw that way because they couldn't draw in others.
it really helps humanize the
Yeah.
ancient Egyptians, absolutely, because you do see, first of all, a process of learning in some cases where people are learning how to draw a cartouche or draw the king, and that's always fun to see. But then, you can also see a variety of different types of, people who are just drawing, who are not necessarily artists. And then and then when they're just sketching, it's sort of,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I think the
It-
thing that this has taught me too when I was studying it is that all of these ostraca serve different purposes as well, and that, just because you're looking at a materials that all look the same, that doesn't mean that they all have the same function or meaning or value.
yeah. And of course, the cultural context and what your discussion of art and icons and how a whole story can be seen in one image, can be reflected through just one image that can be understood by people who have this background knowledge was also extremely fascinating. That we can look at an image and not understand it, but the ancient Egyptians, to them, oh, that's this story. They
Hmm.
could tell. And the part when you mentioned also, it's also very interesting how on these figured ostraca you have anthropomorphic animals and represented with animals that were not anthropomorphized on the same ostracon.
Right.
And that kind of reminded me of, Mickey Mouse and Pluto and Goofy. So Goofy is a dog, and so is Pluto, but Pluto is not anthropomorphized, while Goofy is. And
Yeah.
and, and the mouse is the owner of the dog. And it's sort of the same thing.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I think this is also why I was so drawn to this material too,
Yeah.
because when I was researching a dissertation topic, I'm also really interested in the history of comics and
Yeah.
cartoons. And so I saw them, I'm like, oh, these are kind of like that. I wonder what this
Yeah.
is about anyway. But it's
Yeah.
true, like we're funny as a species.
Yeah, yeah. And you did discuss Zootopia as well. So you
Yeah.
were, yeah, no, it was really, really a fascinating book. I'd like to, if anybody else has any questions, please type them in the Q&A. If the fact that you can't find the Q&A box is what's stopping you, just type it in the chat.
Mhm.
So I'll just give you a minute just to make sure there are no more questions. Oh, there's another question from an anonymous attendee.
Okay, so throughout the book, you connect textual and visual evidence together. Did you find moments where the imagery communicated ideas more effectively than written narratives? That's a good question. It's hard because it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know if I ever thought of it in this comparative way before because when I was looking at the text, I mean, the texts are strange because they post-date the imagery by so many hundreds of years. And so you kind of have to take that connection, or look at that connection with that in mind. And when I look at the imagery, I see them, try to interpret them as separate, but then use the text as a tool. Um, I I think the nice thing about the imagery, I don't know if it makes it more effective than the written narratives, but they they are designed to be uh, they convey some clear ideas in the sense of, all right, we're obviously, even thousands and thousands of years, in our present day, when we look at them, we're like, okay, this is a role reversal because we all know based on our observation of nature, that cats are like the predators and mice are not. And so when we see them reversed this way, we automatically are able to sort of tell a story about them. And it makes the story a little more open-ended, obviously, because there's no like moral in place with that. Um, so I think they're just, I guess the way to think about it is that I think they're equally effective. I think that the writing might be less ambiguous in a way, and I don't know if that makes it more effective or not. Because maybe sometimes the point for an image and a visual narrative is to be more open-ended. Like you could potentially tell many stories with this image. But of course, even when you look at written fables, and if you don't put the final moralistic line there, those fables can also be very open-ended as well. And when you go to different churches, for instance, and like listen to a priest or any like religious place, right? Whoever's interpreting the texts can do it often in very different ways because there is that ambiguity that is sort of built in there. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Anonymous, but I think that they're both effective, but just very effectively in different ways. For me, I love the images. I'm a very visual person, obviously, being in an art history program, but
I actually love the images much more after reading I've always loved them. I love them much more after reading your book, really.
thank you.
Um, any more questions? We have a shy audience today.
Do I have there is a question that popped up. Do I have a favorite
Oh,
animal fable from the book and why? So the only fable that we've really been able to more fully reconstruct is really and I don't even know if we can say it's like a full reconstruction because we don't know what the actual fable is. It's based on later sources, would be the cat versus the mice. Uh, like where there's apparently some sort of role reversal, there's a war, and then apparently the cats regain their power. Because otherwise, the other fables that may have existed are pretty unclear. Like I don't know I guess maybe I like the hippo and the crow because I'm still trying to figure it out and want to know more about that. And so that's like maybe my new favorite fable because it's so bizarre. And I'm looking at hippo representations right now, and so now I'm starting to like get these ideas. And so maybe I'll return to it at some point. But the other fable that we know about is the one with the bird and the cat, which I guess I don't like as much because there is like the text that sort of helps, and there's no, I don't know, I feel like it's hard, it's not as big of a question to solve for me. I mean, there's always the ending of that fable, which is unclear because it's not been preserved, but yeah, there's still a lot of questions as to what a lot of the motifs actually represent. Um,
can I ask another question? Because I liked your discussion on the difference between nudity, the distinction between nudity and nakedness. So can you just summarize this?
Sure. This is sort of an art historical discussion as
Yeah.
well. So like we often use the terms nudity and nakedness interchangeably, but in art history they mean very different things. So nudity is, sort of embracing your lack of clothing, right? So an ancient Greek depiction of Zeus without his clothes, that would be nudity. Um, Whereas in the cats, in the corpus of the material that I was writing about, I argue that they are in fact naked, like they've been stripped of their clothing. Because that lack of clothing is always emphasized in all of these images. We never see a clothed cat unless it's that one ostracon from the Louvre and where they are fully dressed. Um, and covered up because we in ancient Egyptian we rarely see lack of clothing anyway, And there can be many reasons for it, but the time when people are naked in ancient Egypt is when you're looking at people who have been debased somehow, dehumanized, they are forced servants, slaves. And given like the fable that I believe is being told, I think that this is an extra level of degradation that we're seeing here in these images. Um, because again, they are the only animals that are consistently without clothing. The jackals will sometimes be clothed, the hippo will sometimes be clothed, the caprids will sometimes be clothed. It's just the cats. Yeah,
Thank you.
cute.
Any more questions? It's your last chance to ask a question. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for a lovely discussion and for a very, very rich book that I really enjoyed reading.
Thank
It was a pleasure, really, to have you today.
thank you
Uh,
so much. Really nice to be here.
and we will discuss the recording and see if we can put it on online. And I think we will announce this somewhere. So it will be on our website if we manage to put it online. As you know, the book club is our way to promote our digital library, our very rich digital library. So if you want to suggest a book that you would like us to discuss, please let us know. And you can send an email to the library. I think it's on our website, on the library portal. And If you are not a member already, please do consider becoming an RC member. The library portal is one of our wonderful benefits, and there are more benefits that you can find out more about on our website. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again in our future events.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye
Bye.
bye.